Hello, this is Dr. Barbara Oswald, and this is your Module 3 overview for our PSS 312 Drugs and Behavior class. Module 3 covers legal drugs in our society. By the end of this module, students should be able to at least describe the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of nicotine, and you'll have the opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge on this through discussion options 1 and 2 and homework question 1. Students will also learn to develop an evidence-based treatment for cigarette smoking. We'll discuss this in discussion option 3 and homework question 2. Students will then learn to describe the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of caffeine, assessed through discussion option 4, homework question 3, and the module 3 exam questions. Students will then learn to describe the physiological and behavioral effects of caffeine and what happens following acute caffeine toxicity. And we'll discuss this in discussion option 4, homework question 3, as well as the module 3 exam questions. Next, you'll learn to describe the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of alcohol and explain the effects of chronic heavy drinking. We'll discuss this in discussion options 5 and 6, and you will be assessed on your knowledge of this through homework question 5 and the module 3 exam questions. Finally, in this module, students will learn to define alcohol use disorder, or AUD, explain its etiology, meaning how it develops, and address whether or not alcohol use disorder can be treated. We'll discuss this in discussion option 7 and homework question 6. So what should you do for Module 3? Well, in Module 3, we'll read 3 chapters in our textbook, Chapters 7, 8, and 9. You'll read the Module 3 research article provided on Canvas. This article actually looks at research investigating the effects of energy drink and alcohol combinations. Then you'll take practice quizzes over Chapters 7, 8, and 9. You'll participate in the Module 3 discussion. You'll complete the Module 3 homework questions, and you'll complete the Module 3 exam. I'll also note that at the end of Module 3, you should submit your APA-style reference page that will include at least three references that will support the final paper for this class. So to give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover in the module, Module 3 looks at legal drugs in our society. We'll focus on 3 legal drugs: nicotine, caffeine, and alcohol. So a lot of people may ask why these drugs first, especially when the next chapter in our textbook actually is about cocaine. So why am I skipping cocaine and moving to these drugs? Well, I think it's really important to look at the legal drugs in our society first, and we can evaluate the economic impact, the abuse potential, the addiction potential, these legal drugs in our society, so that when we move on and start talking about the illegal drugs or the legally restricted drugs in our society, things like cocaine, methamphetamine, the opiates, even marijuana, other hallucinogenic drugs, we can start to kind of think about why are some of these drugs, like alcohol and nicotine, for example, still legal while other drugs are illegal. So to give you a quick overview, the chapters actually will follow the same general plan. In Chapter 7, we'll start by looking at nicotine. We'll talk about the history of tobacco use worldwide and in the United States. We'll look at the prevalence of tobacco use worldwide and in the United States. We'll talk about the initiation of smoking, or what drives most people to start smoking. Then we'll look at the pharmacology of nicotine, including, you might remember our acronym ADME from Chapter 4. That's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. Then we'll talk about tolerance and dependence on nicotine, the effects of chronic use. We'll also explore the effects of passive smoke. And we'll talk about treatment of cigarette smoking. In Chapter 8, we'll look at caffeine, and very similarly, we'll talk about the history of caffeine use, the prevalence of caffeine use, the initiation of caffeine use, pharmacology and pharmacodynamics of caffeine, the effects of chronic caffeine use, and therapeutic effects of caffeine. And then finally, in Chapter 9 in this module, we'll look at alcohol. Alcohol we'll approach a little bit differently. We'll first define what we mean by an alcoholic beverage. Then we'll talk about the history of alcohol use, prevalence rates of alcohol use in the United States, including the frequency of underage drinking and binge drinking, and focusing on drinking on college campuses because that's a big issue for us. We'll also talk about the pharmacology and pharmacokinetics of alcohol. There are some therapeutic uses of alcohol, so we'll sort of try to examine that. I know there's a lot of mythology surrounding, the benefits of alcohol in the treatment of, lowering your risk for heart disease and things like that. So we'll examine some of that data. We'll also talk about the acute effects of alcohol and the effects of chronic heavy use. And like I mentioned a second ago, the effects of binge drinking. And then we'll talk about developing of AUD or alcohol use disorder, and we'll address treatment of alcohol use disorder more in Chapter 15. So I look forward to learning with you in Module 3, and as always, email if you have any questions.